Welcome to the All About Carbs video lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about carbs. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and most importantly, how to tell what carbs are right for you to eat in order to start improving your metabolic health and, more importantly, your liver health. So let's dive in. But what is a carbohydrate? Let's first start off by defining what carbs are so that we are all on the same page. For the purposes of this video, carb is anything that contains glucose, fructose, sucrose, lactose, or maltose in the form of cornstarch or maltodextrin, etc., or any combination of the above. And this includes foods like all vegetables, fruits, grains, nuts, seeds, juices, sweets, breads, cereals, milk, and milk products, and anything with added sugar, which is super important. And now that we have defined what carbs are, let's now talk about which carbs you should be eating more of and which carbs you should be eating less of, and more importantly, how to tell the difference. And keep in mind that this information will also apply to other related conditions to MASLD like PCOS, hypothyroidism, metabolic syndrome, because they're all related, right? And carbs will have a very similar effect on all of these conditions. So let's dive in. Now, the research around the metabolic effects of carbohydrates on MASLD and related conditions is vast. There's just a ton of information, a ton of complex science behind this particular topic. And if we were to talk about every single nuance of every single type of carb and what it does to your liver or to your health, this video would be hours long. So in order to keep things as simple as possible for you, so you can start applying this information right now, I'm just going to start with giving you 4 simple questions that you can ask yourself in order to figure out whether or not a particular source of carbs will either help you or hinder you. And those questions are, is this carb a whole food? Does this carb have at least 4 grams of fiber per serving? Is there no added sugar to this carb? And lastly, can I tolerate this carb? Now, if you ask yourself these 4 simple questions the next time you go grocery shopping and the next time you're about to eat a carby food, and you answer yes to all 4 questions, then that carb will help you defeat the MASLD minions and improve your liver health. If you answer no to 1 or more of these questions, then that particular carb will likely worsen your MASLD minions or at least not be ideal, and therefore you should eat less of them or completely avoid them. This is it. This is the easiest way to tell based on the scientific literature whether or not you should be eating that particular carb or not, no matter what it is. And now that you have these super simple but super powerful questions, let's talk about what these questions actually mean. Like, what does it mean for a carb to be a whole food carb? How can you tell whether that carb has a high amount of fiber or not, and so on and so forth? And let's start with what is a whole food? Like, what does that mean, right? Well, when we talk about whole foods, we're talking about the difference between something that is unprocessed versus something that is processed. When a food or a carb is unprocessed, that means that the food is as close to farm to table as possible, meaning that the food or ingredient or that particular carb has been minimally processed before it reaches your kitchen and you eat it. And on the flip side, processed food is food that started off as whole food, but then went through a manufacturing process where things start to get taken out of it or other ingredients start to be added into it, and it's been altered before it has a chance to reach you as the consumer. Now, some obvious examples of minimally processed whole foods would be things like fruits and vegetables, right? But unless you're only going to be eating carbs that you literally pick out from the ground all of the time, you're probably going to end up eating foods that are processed to one extent or the other. So what do you do if you want to eat a healthier pasta or want to use a prepackaged sauce, or maybe you're not able to cook home meals from scratch and need to get most of your food from prepackaged meals, for example? Well, then the next best thing is to find foods that are as minimally processed as possible and that use whole ingredients. Let's take this ramen noodle example. If you look at the ingredients list for this Maruchan ramen noodle soup, you're going to notice a few things. One, it's a very, very long list of ingredients. Now, think about this for a second. What is pasta or what is ramen? What is it fundamentally? It's basically some wheat flour or some kind of flour of some sort, a little bit of egg, water, salt, and maybe some other seasonings. If there are dozens of ingredients listed on that package that you're reading, especially ones that you can't even pronounce, then I would stay away from it and go to a better option, because that is a clear indicator that it's been heavily processed. Especially when you see enriched ingredients, like enriched wheat flour in this case. Now, when you see a bunch of different vitamins and minerals added to the ingredients list, that means that the grains that they use to make the flour are highly processed and refined, because they strip all of the healthy nutrients when they make the flour to make these noodles or this ramen. And the FDA forces these companies that have done this to enrich right? Quote unquote, enrich these flours with these added vitamins and minerals. However, they only end up actually adding just a fraction of all the healthy nutrients that was once present in these grains before they heavily processed them. Now compare that to this other brand of ramen in which the ingredients is literally just black, brown, and white rice flours and water. And this is actually what you're looking for. You're looking for foods or prepackaged foods that have the minimal amount of ingredients possible in order to make that food, because that means that there's been minimal amounts of processing done in order to create that food product for you. And another thing to note, that if you notice, the difference between the first ramen example and the second one is that the second ramen example uses more whole ingredients, meaning it's literally black, brown, and white rice flours, right? The soup pack has white miso powder, white onion powder, soybeans, sea salt, mushroom powder, dried parsley, dried carrots. It is not hydrolyzed corn protein or sodium hexametaphosphate or monosodium glutamate, which is MSG, by the way. You should avoid that. But this is a super simple way to tell whether a food has been heavily processed or minimally processed in this case. But now that we're on the topic of whole ingredients, let's clarify something that most people are just completely confused about. And that is, what is the difference between true whole grain versus fake whole grain? This is super important because food manufacturers are legally allowed to trick you with clever marketing and purposely mislead you into thinking that you're buying a real whole grain food or a food that contains whole grains, when in reality you're doing the opposite and are consuming carbs that actually worsen your health. So let's start this by explaining what does it mean for a bread or a cereal or a tortilla or a pasta or whatever kind of carb it is to be whole grain or to contain actual whole grain ingredients. Let's take wheat, for example. Now, what you're seeing here on screen is a diagram that showcases the anatomy of a whole wheat grain. And as you can see here, the whole grain has several different parts. The first part is the bran layer. Now, the bran layer is where all the fiber is, right? And a lot of the minerals are found in the whole grain. Then you have the germ, which contains a lot of the proteins and the vitamins and the minerals that we get from whole grains. And then finally, we have the endosperm, which contains all of the starch, all of the sugar, and all of the glucose. Now, when we're talking about whole grain pasta or whole grain cereal or whole grain bread, whole grain means that all of the parts of the grain is used to make that particular flour, to make that bread or pasta or whatever it is. But most grain products, especially ones that are heavily processed, only actually end up using the endosperm, right? The part that has all the sugar and all the glucose, and get rid of all the healthier parts like the bran layers or the germ, which makes the flour a lot less healthier for you because it's just literally the sugary parts that they're using to make that bread or pasta or whatever it is. And this is especially true when it comes to white flours or unbleached flours or enriched flours. So how can you tell if that specific product is actually using whole grains in their ingredients list? Well, the simplest way is by reading the actual label and the ingredients list and looking for the right words. According to WholeGrainsCouncil.org, which is an organization dedicated to researching whole grains, there are several different ways to tell, based on the label or the ingredient, whether or not that particular food has actual whole grains. For example, if the label says 100% whole grain, then legally that means that that product has no refined flour in it, which is really good. You want to go for more of that. However, if they say that it's made with whole grains, then what that means is that it may contain a little bit or a lot of whole grains, but there's really no way to tell. If the label says whole grain, then as little as 51% of the flour in that food is actually to be coming from whole grain, which is not good. If it says good source of whole grain, then only about 15 to 25% of it is going to be actual whole grain, which is a big problem. And if it says multi-grain, then it's usually a mixture of grains, possibly all or mostly refined grains. In addition to that, you can also read the ingredients list of any package or food that supposedly contains whole grains to actually tell whether or not that's actually true. For example, here, if you see whole grain plus the name of that grain, so whole grain wheat or whole grain corn or whole grain oats, then that means that that product actually has the true whole grain, and so on and so forth. And again, avoid bleach and unbleached flours or enriched flours. And finally, it's important to note that the order of the ingredients matter as well. They are listed from greatest amount to least amount. So if that bread or pasta or whatever it is has whole grain wheat listed as the first ingredient or one of the first ingredients, that means that that bread or pasta or whatever it is mostly made up of that whole grain. However, if you see that the whole grain wheat is listed somewhere in the middle or towards the end of the list, then it's not going to have that much whole grain in it. So now let's talk about fiber. What is a high fiber carb? How much fiber should you be eating per serving, and why is it even important in the first place? Now, I want you to understand that not all carbs have the same effect on our metabolism. The amount of fiber in that carb will greatly determine if that particular food will either help your liver or your metabolism or not. As a general rule, the more fiber a food has, the better it's going to be for you and your liver. The less fiber it has, generally speaking, the worse it's going to be for you. One of the biggest drivers of fatty liver disease and metabolic dysfunction in general is the presence of insulin resistance. Now, there are many different reasons why insulin resistance can occur, but one of the more common ones is because we consume too much of low fiber, high sugar carbohydrates. When we consume these kinds of foods, our blood sugar levels are constantly rising, they're constantly spiking, and therefore our pancreas now has to produce more insulin in order to get rid of that sugar from your blood and put them into your cells. But when you keep consuming these low fiber, high sugar carbohydrates throughout the day, your blood sugar levels are constantly spiking, and therefore your pancreas keeps producing more and more insulin. Now, after a certain point, when your cells become bombarded by insulin constantly, they become desensitized to it. And when your cells become desensitized to insulin, aka insulin resistant, then that sets you up to develop and progress your fatty liver disease and all the muscle minions that drive the disease. Now, one of the biggest ways that you can prevent insulin resistance or even reverse it is by consuming more fiber. Now, if you take a look at this paper that we have on screen, this particular paper found that people who consumed at least 14 grams of fiber for every 1,000 calories had less insulin resistance. And the reason fiber does this is because when we consume fiber with our food, it slows down the absorption of glucose, of fructose, of fats and proteins, really anything, right? Because it turns into this kind of like gooey substance that mixes with our foods that is being digested within our intestines, and it slows down the absorption of these things, and therefore it prevents sudden spikes of glucose in your bloodstream. And in general, we want to be consuming at least 30 grams of fiber per day at minimum that you can split across all the different meals that you'll be having. Now, the best and easiest way to get this fiber intake is by consuming more whole foods, right? Whole fruits, whole vegetables, whole nuts, whole grains with every meal. But if you're buying prepackaged food, right, like pastas or cereals or anything like that, then you need to read the nutrition label and see how much fiber per serving is in that food. And you can very easily do this by looking at the nutrition facts label, going to the total carbohydrate section, and looking at the dietary fiber content here. And remember, we are looking for at least 4 grams of fiber per serving. The more, the better. Now, as a caveat, I want you to be aware of keto breads, right? Those kind of low carb alternative breads or tortillas or cereals or whatever they are, because they usually have a lot of inflammatory oils in them. And we'll learn more about inflammatory fats and, good fats and more healthier fats or less healthy fats in the next lesson. But even if they do have more fiber, I just want you to pay attention because a lot of them tend to have a lot of unhealthy oils in them. And now let's talk about added sugar. Like, what is added sugar and what does it look like so you make sure that you're not consuming it? When we talk about added sugar, we're talking about food that has extra refined carbohydrates or sugars that are added to the food, typically to enhance its flavor and palatability. And some of the more common added sugars that you will see and read in the ingredients list for a lot of these foods include things like sucrose, high fructose corn syrup or just corn syrup, fruit juice concentrate, maltodextrin, dextrose, malt sugar or syrup, agave, barley malt, turbinado, and more. And you'll tend to find a lot of this added sugar in things like bottled drinks, especially sodas or Gatorade, stuff like that. Flavored milk, like almond milk, for example, or other milk alternatives tend to have a lot of added sugar. Iced tea, lemonade, soda, sports drinks, pastries, chips and snacks. Breads and cereals are very commonly known to have added sugar in them. Canned foods, sauces, dressings, and even yogurt, especially low-fat yogurt, because a lot of low-fat yogurt, in order to make up for the low fat, they add more sugar in order to enhance the flavor of it. And you will find a more complete list of all of these known added sugars in the PDF nutrition guide in the description. But why is added sugar such a big issue? Well, I think the problem is best summed up from this great paper that was put together by the well-known Dr. D. Nicolantonio and his colleagues. And here's an excerpt from that paper that I think really does a good job in explaining why added sugar is so toxic to us. And it reads, in modern times, sugar has been isolated and refined to such a degree that it allows it to be integrated into the food supply in quantities and concentrations that do not occur naturally and are unlikely to have been encountered in human evolutionary history. Pure crystalline sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and other caloric sweeteners consumed in beverages and processed foods provide a physiological glycemic load, meaning a load of glucose, an elevation in glucose that is not normally supposed to happen, and which overwhelms the body's processing capacity and leads to a lot of detrimental metabolic effects like hyperglycemia, elevated blood sugar, hyperinsulinemia, elevated insulin levels, and oxidative stress. Because of this refinement, added sugars now behave like a drug-like substance. Although edible, added sugars cannot be considered a food, nor can their consumption be equated to eating foods that contain natural amounts of sugar, like fruits and vegetables, but which also provide fiber, vitamins, minerals, and other phytonutrients in those fruits and vegetables that combat the oxidative stress that is produced by the small amounts of fructose present. As the dose makes the poison, the food industry has made it possible for consumers to easily overdose on added sugars, making this an issue and concern for public health worldwide, wherever there is significant consumption of highly processed, refined, and sugar-dense foods. So how do you know if a particular food has added sugars in them? Well, obviously, whole food sources like whole fruits, whole veggies, whole grains, nuts, and seeds, they're not going to have any added sugar to them. They're going to have a natural amount of sugar, which is okay, right, as we just read. But pre-packaged versions of these foods and processed foods will most likely have a ton of added sugar to them, so we have to watch out for those. And the way to tell is by reading the nutrition facts and label, just like everything else, right? We just have to look at the box and see what it says. Now, here we have an example of the Lucky Charms cereal. Right? If you look at the nutrition facts on the Lucky Charms and you go to the total carbohydrate section, as you can see here on screen, this is where you're going to find the information about any added sugars that have been included in the food product. And as you can see here in the Lucky Charms label, there's 12 grams of added sugar that has been included in just 1 cup of this cereal. I don't know about you, but most people that eat Lucky Charms cereal don't just eat 1 cup, they eat several, especially kids. And that's in each serving of these is about 24% of your total daily allowance for added sugar. And when you look at the ingredients list right off the bat, at the very top of the list, you're going to find ingredients like sugar, cornstarch, corn syrup, dextrose, which are all added sugars. Now here's the crazy thing, right? This is the part that makes this so devious. If you notice, the very first ingredient here is whole grain oats, and we also have whole grain corn. And if you remember our whole grain discussion, these 2 ingredients are actually healthy, right? You actually want to eat more of these because they're whole grains. So on its face, this may seem like a healthy option, but then you look at all the added sugars, right? The 12 grams of added sugars that come from cornstarch, the corn syrup, the sugar, and the dextrose, and all the other chemicals and all the other food colorings that have been added to it, and whatever healthy benefits that those whole grains may have are just completely ruined by all this added sugar. So you gotta pay attention and ask all 4 of these questions so that you don't get tricked or cheated by these food companies. And you really want to pay attention to consuming too much added sugar because the literature shows that consuming too much of it will lead to many different issues that can drive and progress your fatty liver disease and make you sicker and gain more weight. Remember the mass-old minions? Well, it turns out that they love sugar, and here's why. Increased added sugar has been associated or connected to things like the signal jammers, obviously an increase in insulin resistance. It'll also trigger your liver to make more new fat. It'll make you hungry all the time, so you're eating more and extra calories, which we know is a big problem. It'll elevate things like your cholesterol levels, your triglyceride levels. It'll make your cells go rogue. Your fat cells will grow because of the excess calories and also because of all the dysfunction that'll occur because you're consuming too much added sugar, and which will then send fat to your liver, like we learned in the mass-old minions. Your pyromaniacs, all of the inflammation, it just gets increased throughout your entire body and of course in your liver. It'll also trigger supply disruptions and nutrient deficiencies, such as magnesium, magnesium, zinc, vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin C, a ton of different nutrients you will become deficient in. And the reason is because your body needs to use these micronutrients in order to properly deal with all the glucose that you're consuming. And therefore, if the demand for these nutrients goes up in your body and you're not consuming adequate amounts of these micronutrients from whole foods in order to keep up with the demand, then you are likely going to become deficient in some or all of these nutrients, which is not going to help your liver or really your metabolism in general. And last but not least, high added sugar intake and low fiber diets help the harmful bacteria in your gut to grow and prevents your healthy bacteria from producing all the nutrients that your intestinal cells need in order to stay healthy and functional. And so your cells break down in your gut and trigger a leaky gut, and therefore these invaders can seep into the bloodstream and go straight to your liver and cause all sorts of havoc there. Now, the last thing that I want to mention in regard to added sugar is the topic of fructose, especially in the form of high fructose corn syrup or any other names that it may be under. Now, most people that have been diagnosed with MASLD or NAFLD have heard to avoid fructose. And for good reason, because fructose is a very sneaky carbohydrate or sugar that has the ability to pretty much be instantly converted into fat, especially within your liver. And here's why. Now, if you look at the slide on screen, we have both glucose and fructose. When we consume large amounts of glucose and it enters our liver or really any other part of our body, it has the ability to be converted through a step-by-step process into fat. Now, here's the thing. When we eat large amounts of glucose and your liver starts to accumulate a lot of fat, your liver has the ability to tell your cells to stop converting glucose into new fat. But when we consume large amounts of fructose, especially in the form of high fructose corn syrup, fructose has the ability to metabolically bypass a lot of these regulatory steps and basically be instantly transformed into fat, especially within our liver. This is what makes fructose so toxic, especially if you already have a fatty liver or PCOS or diabetes or any other metabolic disease or condition. And it is also why it is best to just completely avoid any sources of these refined high fructose corn syrup, or any other derivative of these simple fructose sugars. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about the negative effects of refined fructose, we're talking about fructose in the form of high fructose corn syrup, right? These more refined sources. But what about fruit? Because fruit has a lot of fructose in it as well. And the question is, does it have the same effect? Well, it turns out that the research shows that consuming fructose from whole fruits with a high fiber content is actually not nearly as harmful and is in fact very beneficial for your liver health. For example, in this first paper up top, which was a review of 33 different studies that looked at all the dietary habits of those living with fatty liver disease and those without. And what they found is that those with fatty liver disease actually had lower fruit intake than those without. And the authors and the researchers even suggested that fruits and vegetables can actually have a protective effect in fatty liver disease because they have such a high fiber and antioxidant content. Now, this is key. Remember, it's all about the fiber, right? It's all about the nutrients that come from whole foods. Well, it turns out that if you're eating whole fruits, that's actually better for you. Now, another quick caveat, when we're talking about fruits, we're talking about whole fruits here. I'm not talking about smoothies or juices that you extract from fruit. Generally, I would not recommend juicing at all because you're removing the fiber and you're just kind of left with the actual fructose juice, which could potentially have harmful effects on your liver and your metabolism. However, I do want to say that some smaller studies suggest that fruit smoothies are okay as long as you're using the whole fruit and you're using high fiber fruits like blueberries or apples, etc. So all in all, when it comes to consuming fruits, a general rule of thumb is to consume whole fruits that are high in fiber, at least 4 grams of fiber per serving, in moderation in order to avoid any potential harmful effects from the fructose content, and to reduce or limit the consumption of fruits that have low fiber, which is less than 4 grams of fiber per serving. And I will include a list of these fruits in the PDF guide for your reference. And lastly, what does it mean when we ask ourselves, can I tolerate this carb? Like, what does that mean? Well, basically, when you ask this question, what you're really asking is, how do I feel after eating this particular carb? So if you feel any of these symptoms after eating that particular carb, or really any food in general, then it's probably best to avoid it. So things like having headaches, joint muscle pain, pain in your liver or abdomen, brain fog or fatigue, shortly after eating some kind of carby food, nausea, diarrhea, bloating, constipation. If you have poor sleep, or you feel sort of hungover the next day or the next morning, that's a pretty good sign to avoid that carb. If you are craving sweets in between meals, excessive thirst, anxiety, or just feeling unwell in general after eating it, then you probably should avoid it. And the reason is that these symptoms indicate that there's some kind of intolerance or inflammation that's being triggered in your body from that food. So that is it for this video. Let's do a quick recap and takeaway. First of all, don't forget to stick to your daily calorie goal. Make sure to download the full nutrition guide in the description. Don't forget to practice asking yourself these 4 questions that we just went over anytime you want to know whether that particular carb is going to be good for you or not. Make sure to watch out for those added sugars because they worsen the mast cell minions, fructose and fruit. Remember, high fructose corn syrup, the refined fructose, is something you want to avoid. But fructose from fruit is okay as long as you're eating it in moderate amounts from whole foods and you avoid juicing. Now, how many of your daily calories should be coming from these healthier carbs? Well, as a general rule of thumb, you want about 35 to 40% of your daily calories to be coming from carbohydrates, which you can actually set up in your chronometer in your settings. Now, if you're following a more low carb or ketogenic diet approach, then you want to stick to about 5 to 10% of your total daily calories to come from these carbs. Now, there's no restrictions on veggies, nuts, seeds, and whole grains, like real, true whole grains, if you tolerate them. And again, moderate consumption of whole fruits, and we want to reduce the amount of added sugar as much as possible. Now, obviously, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to completely 100% avoid and remove all added sugar from our diet, because a lot of the foods that we like to eat, our favorite sort of junky foods, if you will have added sugar. And it's okay to consume those as long as you do it responsibly. And so what I want you to do is review the splurging skill from the Hero Skills training lesson, so you learn how to incorporate these sort of less healthy, more sugary carbohydrate meals in a responsible way so you can still enjoy them without sabotaging your results. So that is it for this lesson. The next thing I want you to do is go to the practice ground section and share what your next high fiber whole food carb choice will be for your next meal, and share how you're going to make it tasty and delicious. Here are my references. That is it for this lesson. See you in the next one.